The power of the universe is at your full disposal.
This is the PowerShell Podcast. PowerShell Podcast. It's all about PowerShell and the PowerShell community.
The power
of our future.
Without further ado, please help me in welcoming
Jordan Hammond and Andrew Pla.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the PowerShell Podcast. I'm Jordan. With me is the legend, the absolute PowerShell mega beast, the reason anyone tunes in, Andrew Pla. Hey, like it? I switched it up for you. You got the nice intro.
Yes. I'm often like, what do I say after that? I'll just accept it and roll and pretend like, yeah, that's me. So
it's got to be a burden to hear all of that praise all the time, but it's just something you have to live with.
It is a little wonky at times, definitely. But, you know, it's a thing I have to live with and I accept it. But you know what? Also, I accept amazing contributions from the community, and that's what we're here to talk about today. And I want to get things started off big time with friend of the show, Clayton, dropping a very cool blog about how ChatGPT saved our company $1,500 in less than 15 minutes. Very good article about how Clayton saved his company $1,500 in 15 minutes with some work on a PowerShell script. Read it for yourselves. Very cool. Share it with your friends. Awesome article.
Concur. Like that. I'm contributing again.
We're on the same wavelengths, man.
All right. So we also want to go into the GitHub for Deadly Dog, where he has PowerShell tips, like to help for your terminal.
So yeah, it's a cool little module, Deadly Dog. Our friend, recent friend. Yeah, it's a way to deliver PowerShell tips straight to your terminal. So install module, name, tips. So it's published, but check out the GitHub repository. We will have a link in the show notes. But there's one other one in there that I'd also like to highlight, which is from Killisuit, and that's Ryan Yates is his real name. He has a cool blog about installing PowerShell side by side for testing purposes. I know that's a use case we often hear people running into, so this can help you get started and give you some perspectives in that area. What an amazing community we have here, right? How lucky are we?
The best. Like I said, we get some of the people that have SQL that's like, well, that's just as good, and they're wrong.
Oh,
they're privileged to be part of the first and second best communities. Unfortunately, or not unfortunately, but it's clearly PowerShell's first.
You know, I feel that way, but I haven't experienced enough of SQL community. But I'll say from what I have seen, they got something going on for sure.
Well, everyone we've interviewed that's stretches across those, they're delightful. So it's got to be great. Enough of us. Let's get to the real reason people tune in. We have returning guest, megastar, and this time I'm not going to give the wrong job title. Gilbert Sanchez from Meta. My goodness, I can't talk. My goodness.
Oh my God, that was. I was going to say that I think you had the best Andrew intro for this recording, but I'm pretty happy with my intro. That was a great intro. I also like how you're starting holy wars between the DBA community and the PowerShell community.
I'm picking a strong stance. We are friends, and you know, even in friendships, there's a best, and it's PowerShell. He's gonna
hot takes with Jordan. Welcome.
Like it.
So, been seeing you around a lot, and I've been thinking, man, we needed to chat with our friend again. It's been too long. I think we shared a couple of your blogs a few weeks ago.
Thanks for that.
You're exploring the console and some cross-platform stuff there. So how have you been?
Good. Yeah, man. Things are good. Doing a lot of, testing across different OSs, and I tend to want to share some of this stuff to folks when they start to ask. And then I realize that it's probably better that I write up a post, even if it's like transitory or like changing, just because it's, easier to point folks to one thing. It's funny, in that blog series, like the first thing I wanted to do was sort of like lay down the groundwork. So that way the like following posts weren't going to be like too deep. Like I always kind of shoot for like 5 minutes. If you can read it in 5 minutes, you'll probably get something out of it. And if it's not for you, you can, you skip it. But if you're like, what is this thing? You can at least jump to that first post and kind of be like, what does he mean by console? What does he mean by terminal, right?
Cool. I'm pretty sure they're the exact same thing, right?
They're like the same thing, but they're a little different.
How are they?
See
different?
how I set you up to educate our listeners.
Oh, I know. I'm like, yeah.
Refer to the blog.
Yeah, please. Here, I have a blog for you to read, and I'll tell you what the difference is. But yeah, I mean, I could give the TLDR of that blog post pretty quickly. I mean, so the difference between what were you saying? It was console and what was the one that you got
Terminal.
confused? Terminal. Yeah, so the terminal is like the app, right? That it actually so that would be like Windows terminal. For most people kind of conflate the two because they tend to be the same thing. So you launch like CMD or you launch Windows PowerShell and that, opens up a terminal, but what you're like talking to is actually a console. So this kind of goes back to like, the early days of, systems like, I'm going to like slaughter all the names. So, but yeah, it's essentially what used to be a console that you would go sit at. Now you have a terminal that can kind of talk to that.
Cool. And I guess like programs like PowerShell ship with kind of like a default one, and that's what you're referring to. People using the default terminal.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. So what terminal are you using?
Yeah. So one of the posts that you guys talked about recently was the WES terminal. So I was looking for something that could run on consistently between OSs, and WES term is written in Rust and compiled to work on anything. So pretty regularly, I'm jumping between Linux distros and a Mac machine and a PC, Windows laptop, and so I wanted something that I could try to keep consistent between all the OSs, and mostly because I was tired of getting the wrong key bindings, and where I could control shift left to jump words like that suddenly broke on other OSs and stuff like that. So I just wanted something where once I get my muscle memory going, I don't have to undo that.
It's the way to do it. Now, what's your prompt looking like these days?
So I'm using Starship. Again, because I wanted something consistent between OSs. I know Oh My Posh is another very popular one that is actually written in Go. But yeah, I mean, I don't recall. I don't know that there's one is better than the other. I think I like Starship and how it looked and how it was configured. And so yeah, I just I started using Starship. But I think I talk about that in some of my blogs is sort of one of the things I want to be able to do is to be able to swap stuff. And so if the prompt program or tools don't allow me to kind of ship that configuration easily, that's usually kind of a non-starter, right? Like I commit my stuff to my public .files repo, and when I'm setting up a new box, I just pull that repo down, run my setup scripts, and then now my repo's set up again.
That's one way to do it, man. Very cool.
Yeah.
It's nice having a consistent experience, and it seems like you've taken it to the next level. But as IT professionals or people who do things with computers, we're often in terminals. So really honing in that experience and refining it to what works best for you definitely seems advantageous, especially because you can bring it with you. You can use it on different OSs and all that, kind of versatile.
Yeah, I found myself, especially dealing with machines that are like ephemeral, where I know I'm going to have it for a few weeks. So I want to make it, comfortable, but I don't want to, I don't want to manually set up everything over and over again. And I think it's just that automation mindset, right? Of how do I make it so that this is just easy for me to start next time I get started.
Another way is to just accept the defaults.
I was looking at Jordan.
So I was going to say my current method is I just constantly reinstall and do it manually and forget anything that I do have. Do you have any data to back up that your method of having it specifically how you want without any work is better than struggle?
Do I have any? No. I mean, this is also, I think back to, what some of the guests have talked about, like living off the land, like keeping it to a minimal, right? I think if my work was, visiting different, companies and having to work in their systems, this is probably not something I would do. I would definitely learn, live off the land, right? It's why I know how to use VI, because if I ever get on a Linux system, I need to know enough VI to be able to edit some files. It's not my same Vim with all my sweet plugins, but I can do enough work to kind of be able to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish. So it's not that it's better or worse. It's it's just different.
I think that's one of the rare cases where you're safe to say it's better. Like no one's going to give you pushback.
I mean, it's better for me, right? Like, I definitely know people who are like, they don't want to, touch anything, and their muscle memory is, baked to that, to the standard, right? And for me, where that gets tricky is like switching between OSs. That's where it was like that, having to switch from Windows, PowerShell mode to like Bash to to ZSH to whatever. The cost was just starting to become too high for me because I was doing that on enough of a regular basis that it just felt like a problem that should be solved.
So I'm looking through the list of the shells that you were using, and I'll notice only one of them worked on every single operating system.
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely pushing folks towards towards the one true shell.
Yeah. There's pretenders, there's other things, but everyone knows PowerShell is where you go. Greatest thing ever created.
I mean, I was recently referred to at work in a work post as they CC'd me and said CC Gilbert, known PowerShell lover. So I'll take that with pride.
That is high praise.
I should get that printed and put on a.
Is it too late to change your job title to known PowerShell lover? Because I would.
It's not actually. We have the ability to set our own titles, which is how I got to become Señor systems engineer. And yeah, I mean, PowerShell lover could be the new title.
Known PowerShell lover. So is any of this because we had recently a guest, Jason Helmick, that talked about Cloud Shell, which is basically a shell where you can do a lot of this, but it's just kind of automatically online. Is that something where it duplicates some of this, or is that just more only for your Azure or AWS space?
Yeah, so I'm not super familiar with Cloud Shell, but from my understanding, it is mostly a shell that's available, in I think it's Azure, but I could be wrong. If you were maybe starting at that point and then connecting to your endpoints, but again, once you could, like, let's say from Cloud Shell, I connect to a Linux box and it doesn't have any of my settings, I'm back to using the defaults. And I just won't bring myself down to that level.
Yeah, that's fair. So you don't want to sit there and wallow with the unwashed masses of default usage.
No, I got to rib Jordan a little bit while I'm on.
Please do. I need all the backup I can get.
I don't see why. I think there's only been one person. They didn't agree with me. They just said, hey, to each their own. I don't think I've had one person agree with me on just defaults.
I honestly think, I mean, it's, the what is it? It's like when people talk about like, this is the right way, when you first start to learn, and then eventually you kind of, you learn like it basically, the answer is it depends. And like being able to say like, well, here's the trade-offs. There's a cost to setting all this up, right? It's not like I can get on the box and just start working if I want this, right? Like I do have to learn how to work in those systems with default, right? There are going to be boxes I get on that I don't want to touch, and I got to just use the live off the land stuff. But in shells and prompts that I'm in daily, like I like to have it look the same and have my nice colors and my little icons and stuff, and add a little joy to my day.
So I will say, and Andrew's going to take this as a victory. If I was in a job where I was doing consistent things like that, I probably would worry about it more. But my job entails learn new thing, teach about new thing, talk about it on the internet.
Yep.
So everything me starting from a default works because I'm learning something new about it. So if it is specific about PowerShell, the default is what I need, and I just add what I want. So for my current work environment is the main driving force for my defaults. If I moved to something where I was more DevOps or consistently writing code that would be going in production, I have no doubt that my setup would change significantly.
Well, and it makes sense, right? Like if I start with my setup and I show somebody who's brand new, they're going to be like, whoa, your thing is totally different than my thing. Like, am I missing prerequisites, or what actually applies to what you're trying to teach me versus like your fancy shell? And so, I mean, when I'm doing like internal training and stuff like that, I definitely go to like a stock thing, right? Like your PowerShell prompt will say PS, right? Like I know what the standard looks like, and I'll use that for screen captures and stuff like that. So that way, that's not an additional barrier that people have to kind of think through, right? Like the easier you make it for people to kind of, learn it, the better. So.
Dang, very true. Especially when you're teaching people, the super complex, fancy setup can be intimidating for beginners too. But
yeah,
dude, what's been going on in the module world lately? You seen any cool new modules that have been kind of piquing your interest, or?
Yeah. I mean, I feel like I promised the next time I'd come on, I'd give like mdgrs a shout out. I know he's gotten one before with James, but yeah, I mean, I feel like every time I see him release a module, I'm like all over it, and it's sort of what it's what adds to the additional level of like customization I get to do, right? Like one of the problems I had was in one tab I'd be running something, and that would in one shell, right? So I was running something in PowerShell Core, but I needed to run something else in Windows PowerShell, and so they were two different tabs. And the ability to dynamically set the title to show me like, oh, that job had finished, and know that now that's finished, I can like now proceed to the next thing, instead of having to flip back and forth. Was it's like that kind of stuff. It's like little things that make work life easier. So.
And just so we're clear, you came out strong on what the name was, because I know Andrew and I always guess around, and you can confirm that's actually how we are supposed to be pronouncing it.
I swear I saw it either on Twitter, on Mastodon, and I've been trying to find it, but I can't find it. So I'm fairly certain he said that it's just a handle, and it doesn't have a pronunciation. So, but I feel like you should guys just have him on, and he can correct it.
I've asked. He's working on it on his end. I don't think he speaks much English, but you couldn't tell that from his written word. Very, very well written. But it's a goal of mine to get him on.
Sweet.
Yeah.
Oh, I found it.
Oh, okay.
It is. He says, and mdgrs pronouncing alphabets is correct. It's just a handle.
Aha! Look at that. Well,
yeah.
I was finding like magical Final Fantasy VII ties, and now the illusion is shattered.
Yeah, mdgrs says that they're actually learning, improving their English by listening to the podcast. So
Sweet.
Hopefully we're not leading them astray.
I can barely speak it, and they have me on every week. So
Same.
I have a weird accent, so I'm sure it doesn't help.
I like your accent. I don't think it's that weird. Maybe I'm used to it. But what about PS Readline? Because, we're talking about this. I know you mentioned it a little bit before, but anytime we could get the excuse to, I love talking about PS Readline.
Yeah.
You like messed around with it a good amount?
Yeah, so I definitely stole some of your stuff, your outgrid view, to show the history. As soon as I saw that, I was like sold. I was like, that's a great example of like modifying PS readline. I've definitely modified colors, a couple of shortcuts just so that they're consistent between OSs. But I mean, it's, I feel like it's the one module I probably use the most because it's literally like every single interaction with PowerShell is leveraging PS readline.
Yep. And it has been for a while, but nowadays I really like where it's at. It just seems like there have been so many helpful contributions over the past few years that it's just such a workhorse now.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that we're talking about this in mdgrs, but I don't remember if it was him or somebody else, but they were talking about replicating another Linux tool that shows examples. And that was super interesting. I was mostly interested because being able to show people work-specific examples would be really nice. And like, if you join a company, you're not going to know all the internal modules, right? You're not going to know. Excuse me. You're not going to know when to call a module that interacts with your internal tool, right? So like having a way where you can type something kind of simple and then have it return like some examples would be really, really awesome. And when we were talking about it, I had said I think this could be accomplished with PS readline, because I think there was some questions around like trying to do fuzzing and stuff like that, and that's starting to get in the realm of like way more advanced. I'm pretty sure like Jekyll was on that thread, and like that's like S tier stuff. So I'm just editing my profile. So
and having fun with it though, that's important.
Yeah. So this one's not a module, but you do have a GitHub repo for the PowerShell Podcast sync.
I do. So this was, I probably put it together after I chatted with you guys last. And the goal was to actually read the PowerShell RSS feed, look at the descriptions, and look for like handles either on like Twitter or X, or Mastodon, and then with Twitter having like a list, starting to add basically speakers who have been on the podcast to that list, so that people can kind of go and subscribe to that and just like see all the people who have chatted with you guys. I was trying to do the same thing with Mastodon, but there's not really an equivalent as far as like a public list. So that repo definitely needs some love. I think that because I haven't touched the code, the action that just runs regularly, basically they're like, hey, you have a cron, but you haven't touched the code. If you don't touch the code after a certain amount of time, they just pause it. So I got to poke it a little bit and get it running again, and maybe try to figure out a good answer for what to do for like Mastodon users to make it easy to follow folks.
But the important part of that one is the X account, because apparently I can't use Twitter anymore.
Yeah.
the banner for that one is the one where I'm front and center and Andrew is back row. And it's important that we have that one because that's the truth. That's the way this works.
They had to listen for 26 minutes to get the truth, but ignore that glowing intro that I got earlier. This is how it really goes down between us.
Too brute.
I derailed the conversation, but you know what? It's worth it. I'm happy I did it.
I was waiting for you to ask how often you think about Rome, because I just quoted Caesar. So,
are you an often thinker? I'm not. I haven't thought about it much since high school. I'm not a historian, unless it comes to PowerShell, because I love hearing about the early days and seeing where things have gotten, and now life has gotten so good for these PowerShellers. They're focused on customizing their prompts and making them fancy and cross-platform. Can you believe it? how far we've come. We got modules like mdgrs, making everything even fancier.
Now that we know how to pronounce it, watch out.
Yeah, constant references now that we know how to pronounce it. So you've been doing any RPGing lately? I know you're the guy with the RPG modules.
I feel like this is a very common story with people who play RPGs. Is like eventually the group, it just like falls off. And I think I literally like last week was like, it seems like we haven't been able to get together. I'm just going to assume that like, let's just start setting some like actual days instead of assuming we're going to play every week. And then, try to be a little bit more consistent about when we actually get to play. But yeah, I mean, I still love all the RPG stuff. It's funny because I have all these different systems and all these different modules, and like the mechanics are super interesting to me, right? The randomness. I think that's what got me into it anyways, was the fact that a roll of luck is going to determine what you can do or can't do. And yeah, it's like, and I was like, wait, I know how to do this in PowerShell. Get random. That's pretty straightforward. Like, how can I keep doing that? And then when I was DMing at one point, I needed to be able to, the other classic thing is like, so what's the shopkeeper's name? And you're like, you have to come up with a name on the spot. I was like, if I can generate an entire character with a command, that just seemed like a really cool thing to have. And so, yeah.
You would need to have varying levels based on the type of character. So like if it was a shopkeeper, a threshold for certain stats. Because I mean, I guess it's not impossible the shopkeeper would have a low charisma, but they're not going to be a successful one.
I mean, but tell me that wouldn't be interesting, right? You go into a shop and this shopkeeper is like totally aloof and like is gonna fall for like a terrible trade. Like that'd be a funny encounter to go through, right? Like, so again, that's why I love all that randomness. Is like my brain wouldn't have gone to that, but like if that's what I was given, like let's roll with it. And like this could be an enjoyable experience, even if it's like, kind of crazy.
It would require a lot of adaptability as a DM to roll with what you got there.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I think one of the systems that I set up was a system called Maze Rats. And one of the big things is they talk about, you get a personality type and it kind of has some descriptors about the person. And even though it's a limited subset, because there's enough variation between the different things, you like reading the 3 or 4 different descriptors, you immediately kind of come to mind with like what this person looks like, right? Like, or what their past was or something. And now you're like, oh, well, if they're a performer, they're going to be very outlandish and they're going to be using their arms a lot. And, versus like someone who's more meek. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, it's work to suddenly embody that person on the fly, but it's, that's part of the game.
Fair enough. Now, I wanted to ask about your templating, because last time we talked to you, we talked about templating a whole bunch, and you were on some stucco. Those were your vibes. Are you still rocking out on stucco? Still working well for you? Customizations? Where are we with things?
Yeah, it's funny. I think at one point I mentioned, I think probably on X, Twitter at the time, I think somebody was doing a talk on one. I really haven't had a chance to branch out, and I've been kind of on the stucco train for a while. Just because I really like Saki, and once I got it working and tweaked, like recently I published I recently published a couple modules, and they were basically stucco based, but I was able to take kind of some of my actions. So like I have an action that publishes the module when it's merged into main. And so and I check to see if the version's been bumped. So if you merge into main and the version has been bumped, it just rolls to the PowerShell Gallery. And so that means that I don't have to worry about that stuff. I just make my changes, bump my versions, update the changelog. And if my tests pass and the version is different than what's published, it'll publish it.
Nice. I'm thinking of some PowerShell Summit talk ideas, and one of them has to do with templating. I won't say too much because I want to make sure I get it submitted before I say it to hundreds of people.
Well, it's funny because I've thought about potentially. So GitHub has the idea of like repos that are template repos that you can just copy. I've thought about potentially doing that just because, even for myself, because I'm like, I know that the current version of Stucco has a bug, I think, when it was built. And so, if you see that you're not familiar with that stuff, you might be like, well, I'm just going to move on. But because I'm like, oh, I know where all these little missing bits are. Let me just go put those in place. Then it becomes a non-issue. But if I had a template, that people could just literally copy and paste, and I'd probably include this, all the stuff that I do, which is using the make docs, publishing to GitHub IO, right, and then publishing to the gallery as part of the landing flow.
Yeah. Last week we talked to Joel Bennett about GitOps and kind of doing things based around checking in code and kind of a pipeline. He talked a lot about kind of how Kubernetes figures into those things, but it sounds like you are sort of doing that approach for a lot of things, right? Check in code, and then maybe you can speak to what kind of setups you got going on.
Yeah, so I have, so for example, on the module repos, I set up a GitHub action that runs the test suite on every check-in, right? And it not only does it run every test, but it runs it on Mac, Windows, and Linux. And so it's pretty cool because it's super quick. It takes a few seconds to do each, and then time for the boxes to get spun up. But what's nice is even on a pull request, when those tests run, sometimes I'll be writing on a Windows machine and then find out, oh yeah, there's a weird edge case in Mac where I assumed the type was there or something, right? And I've caught some of that stuff by being able to run those tests. And so once I see all the tests pass, I know that when I merge it into main, the tests are still going to pass, and now I can land successfully. And so that means that it also makes it so that if anybody wants to contribute, it becomes very easy to say, like, even if they don't test themselves, as soon as they open a PR, the test will run anyways. And that stuff, there's another action I leverage to publish the test results. And so I can see, hey, you have some tests that are failing. Let's go take a look. Oh, you have, this doesn't work on this OS, or whatever the failure's result of. But
so if I tried to submit to that, I'm pretty sure the result would get your code's garbage, go away.
I don't think they have that action yet.
Oh, not yet? Okay.
maybe I got to make that one.
That's an April Fool's action right there. But let me go through this again with you real quick, just to kind of help people who are more beginners, because we're all about people getting into GitHub and getting involved. And I know whenever I first got started, you look at a module and you're like, all right, I know PS1 files. Maybe PSM1s and PSD1s I can handle. But you look at some of these repositories, and there's a .tests or whatever folder, and there's all these like source folder and all this kind of stuff that can be pretty confusing. But from what you're describing right here, it sounds like, so they got their repository, they got their code. They're also probably going to have like some kind of folder that has their tests that get run by the GitHub action, right? Does that sound about right?
Yes.
Okay, so cool. So then like whenever you check in new code or you try and do a pull request, that can trigger an action. And I guess in this instance, you're using GitHub actions, and that GitHub actions kind of just runs some code that you have it do. And the testing one would just kind of run some code that says, hey, grab this folder, grab these tests, and run it.
Yeah, so I think part of the reason why I've stayed with Stucco, and one of the reasons, like I maybe little heavy of a word, I fell in love with it was because the VS Code actions. So the VS Code stuff that you get means that if you're working in VS Code, you can actually run tasks, and one of the tasks is build, and one of the tasks is test. And so that means on my local box, even before I submit a PR or anything, I can run the same exact tests. So I feel like lately in the last few weeks, I keep like shouting about how much I love test-driven development because I will go and write the test, and I'm like, I know this is what it should look like, and then running the code and being like, oh wait, I just realized because of the way that this array is getting built that this fails, and like I don't think I would have if I just pushed the code. I thought my code was good, right? But like being able to run the test and be like, actually, it broke something was really nice. So that development cycle of being able to like, save your code, run the test, save your code, run the test, like is really nice. And then the GitHub action literally just runs that same exact thing, except on machines that aren't yours. That isn't it worked on my box, like that's not a problem anymore. It's now it worked on GitHub's boxes. And now you can prove that, there isn't some weird transitory thing on your machine that is affecting it. So,
yeah, I dig that a lot. You're talking about test-driven development and writing tests and all that kind of thing. And, earlier we were talking about prompts and how, there is some initial investment and maybe for some people it's not worth it and this and that. Whereas, what we're talking about here with test-driven development and the way that you're handling your code and stuff, it's not so much a thing that we can just be like, oh no, it's too much of an investment. It's too valuable. It's the correct way of doing things. It's the type of investment that you kind of have to do to have an okay environment you're working in. But you still reap huge benefits where you're able to, as you're speaking to, develop new code easier, right? You can test your things locally. You can verify, kind of sanity check yourself, and that's just part of it. But there is definitely an initial learning curve to figuring out how that will all work and going through creating your first project. But I think using Stucco is a great way to start exploring that. But when you're looking at repositories, at least for me, I found a ton of value when I could actually start understanding what everything was for.
Yeah.
What all the different folders were for.
Yeah, I think that's maybe one of those things that is lacking, and it's probably true also for some of my module repos, is to describe like, here's what each folder does. Funny enough, even within a work at a work thing, at a coworker who's leveraging Saki to do a build, and their folder structure was not intuitive to me. And so the first thing I did was, and they didn't have a README. So the first thing I did was I started a README, and I was like, okay, this folder contains this stuff. And I'm like trying to dissect it and like, but putting it in a doc so that the next person who reads it is like, oh, I actually don't need to worry about those folders, or like, I should only touch these folders if I absolutely have to. But I think there's a huge benefit to having like automated testing, because it gives the end user confidence that they're not breaking stuff, right? Like I remember the time code spaces blew me away. I was working on a Go project. I was like, I saw something in Go and I was like, oh, they're calling something incorrectly on Windows. And I hadn't built anything in Go before, but I was able to go to that repo, make the change. They had tests. And because they were leveraging a dev container, everything was there and I didn't need to set that up. And then as soon as I closed that and that code spaces went away, my box didn't have a bunch of extra cruft on it, right? Like that was such a nice experience. And I was like, this is the way. Like I got to make this how all my open source projects look like. Which, funny enough, I'm going to be going to ChefConf very soon, and that's one of the things I'm really going to be kind of pushing is like, how do we make the developer experience easier for users who aren't maybe on the OS that we're expecting, right? Like Ruby stuff on Windows is hard. And so like being able to have a dev container that has all that stuff and can automatically run tests when you're when you save would be really nice.
Agreed. I think that the more attention we pay to any experience, developer experience, user experience, usually seems to be pretty useful efforts. And a lot of what we talk about here is our IT user developer experience of how we use PowerShell, how we leverage it, the different tools in our tool belt, how VS Code is configured for us, if we have testing configured. Over time, that stuff becomes so important, like on a 1 week thing, whatever. But like, if you think about the rest of your career, 10 years potentially, you could be able to be positively influenced by a workflow change.
Yeah, I think I learned a bunch from doing this, right? Like once I learned the VS Code stuff, I was like, wait a second, I could do this in a bunch of repos. Like, we do ask people to, if it says in a wiki, go run this command, it's like, why not make that more obvious to the person who's working on that code, right? Like, or automatic, right? If you can do that, that makes the barrier to entry a lot lower. And like, when it happens automatically, that's even better, right? It's like, even if they didn't read the docs and they edited code and they submitted, the fact that the tests still run now gives you at least confidence that, hey, stuff didn't, like, you as the reviewer know that stuff didn't break, and the contributor didn't need to necessarily know all the details of the project, right? Like, they don't need to know how testing works. They just need to know that a test ran and it was successful. Now, we can definitely ask, say, hey, you're adding something, let's consider adding a test. But, it's a good starting point of, at least we know stuff didn't get broken.
Yeah. And you said that VS Code stuff. And I think that you might be referring to the .VS Code folder.
Yes, correct.
That is like, if you put that in your project root, whatever,
Mhm.
VS Code knows to like look inside that folder for some settings and other things like that. I think that's how the tasks are configured. And really you can configure quite a bunch of stuff. It's a very cool tool, and you can implement that with your own customized stuff internally and really make your stuff fancy.
Yeah, so you can do things like settings. So set settings, VS Code settings for this particular workspace. So let's say, for example, you have a different coding style than maybe what most folks use, right? You can
ODBS.
Yeah, exactly. You can go set that. You can set that in the configuration. You can do things like recommend extensions. So that was something that's very helpful, right? Like, if people aren't normally working on PowerShell and suddenly they're in a PowerShell, a repository with PowerShell code, to say, hey, you should consider installing the PowerShell extension is super helpful, right? Like, these are things that, how would you let a user know otherwise, like, or a developer know otherwise? And VS Code offers some very handy ways to kind of do that.
Yeah, and on the super low end, I know we're talking about developers and all this and that, but like, say you're just an IT person with some scripts, and you have someone else you're working with, or you want to train someone else on your team, the easier you can make this, the more likely they will be actually contributing code.
Yep.
Right? And these user experience or developer experience things do make a difference. They really do. I personally have experienced it. I had a lot of success with using VS Code tasks as part, and combined with like some plaster stuff to help people write new functions. But using those tasks is so huge, and configuring their settings for them when possible and making it consistent, again, out of this world. And then you don't have to do as much work. That's what I like about it. It's like you train other people, like they can help you out now.
I want to know what Jordan thinks.
So what I think is that I so rarely have to contribute to anything that I can see the value on the outside looking in, but I don't experience it, if that makes sense.
I mean, again, to me, the big selling point is like, I don't have to know anything. If I see some code, I think I can kind of figure out what this code does, and I think I just need to tweak this one thing. If that's all I do, and everything else around it ensures that it's safe, and I know that you're making it, like, you just, when I submit that PR, you made sure that I didn't break everything. For me, that's relief, right? Like, if I don't know how to build a Go binary, and like, well, I'm like, oh man, like, how do I know that my code isn't going to break everything? Like, giving that answer is now I'm way more likely to contribute, right? Like, that just makes it easier to kind of get started.
So I am curious, because a lot of the stuff we talk about, all these processes and everything, and you put a lot of work into it, and once it's in place, it's fantastic. But does how mature your organization is towards like a DevOps structure change how much effort you're going to need to put in to get these in place? Or is, as long as you get started, eventually everything will be better? What's I guess best way to look at it?
So the thing we haven't really talked about explicitly, but it sort of is alluded to with GitHub Actions, is like CI/CD, right? Continuous integration and continuous delivery. If your organization does not have CI/CD, it's sort of like you're still going to have to go and run these things by hand, and that makes the value proposition, less great. It's still good, right? Like, let's say I don't have CI/CD, but you submit code, and then I can pull your code and then run the test myself. That there's still value there, but now I'm pulling every request down and running tests, or asking you, hey, when you submit your request, your PR, include your test results. But if you have CI/CD, there's all sorts of CI/CD out there. The value is pretty quick. Like, I think even Stucco has a few options, right? Like, if you have AppFair or GitHub Actions, or I'm forgetting all the CI/CD tools, but as long as there's a way for you to call that same script the way that the build, like calling the build script with the right flags, you will see benefit, right?
So no matter what, there's going to be value within it. Maybe less value up front if it's new to it, but it's a starting point to where you start with some value that just going to grow exponentially. So it's worth doing no matter where your organization is.
I think honestly, even just alone for the tests make a huge difference, especially if we're talking about modules. The amount of times I saw people modify modules and the module didn't actually, like, it would fail to load. And it happened to load because they loaded it once and then they changed something and then it stopped loading. That one test alone is like, it's a silly test. We could just be like, hey, start a new shell, load it. But like, every time you add a process that a person has to go do by hand, there's a higher chance that they're not going to do it. And then now you're introducing risk. Like, I've seen that happen where suddenly a module gets pushed and then it doesn't load anywhere. And then it's like, uh-oh, we got to go and fix that. And when you have a build process like this, you can at least run your test and say, okay, I know at least it'll load. And if that's the beginning, that's at least a decent beginning.
Hey, I'd say that, for some people out there, they may not even be using any source control yet. Yep. So for sure, even if you're just like a lone scripter, start checking your stuff into source control. Like, use GitHub or figure out whatever your company already has. If not, explore some stuff. But you need to be checking in your code, because that liability is really huge if things go wrong. And to recover, it is just, there's such a huge ROI to go from none to some. And then once you have that, you can start exploring CI/CD. But you got to have your code in a repository. Yep.
It's actually one of the first projects I really did it as a contractor at Meta. Was like, the IT department was running off of a share, and I just kept seeing .back files, and I was like, this is what I would normally do, but I'm pretty sure this is not the right thing to do. And again, this is 10 plus years ago, right? And so I was like, we should, these other organizations that are a little bit more mature are doing, even at the company, we're doing actual like code commits. Why aren't we doing this? So I've, for a very short period of time, had the most code commits to this one repo because I checked in all the code. I was like, I'm just going to check in all the code. Please start committing code here. But it made a huge difference in, reverting, right? Sometimes you make a change to code, it gets pushed out, and the problem doesn't show up right away. It shows up later. And you're like, wait a second, what changed? Being able to go and look at that in Git or Mercurial or, heaven forbid, SVN. it still provides value, right? To say, oh, well, if I revert it back to this, does it work again? Okay, we know that's the problem. Plus, I'm ADHD, super forgetful. Being able to say, oh, I did commit this, or I did, or I have a partial commit that I haven't, published. Where was I? Oh yeah, I didn't finish doing this, right? If you're editing a live file, like that becomes trickier.
Yeah, it takes the burden off of each employee who works with any code or infrastructure whatsoever and puts it on the system, right? Like you can now rely on this CI/CD and kind of related systems to offload all of those manual checks, all of the additional burden. So then, just the more you can get bought, at least for me, the more you can get bought into that idea of like, hey, we are building and maintaining an awesome system that can continue to get better, make our lives easier, make our product better, make development easier, blah, blah, blah. Like, I just love that. You can buy into that and you don't have to be like the absolute smartest genius every second of the day in order to not have things go wrong.
Good, because that's exhausting.
Yeah.
So we're missing probably the most important, and it's money. If you have an immature development where no one's doing any of that and you start putting those processes in place and you can show the value that you've performed from that, it's a lot easier to go in the future every time I say, hey, give me money. Maybe be more tactful. I'm not going to tell you how to go about it, but it's a pretty good chip.
I also feel like a lot of companies are sort of almost requiring that now. It's like, you should know how to do this. And I feel like if you're out there and this is, unfamiliar, start with GitHub, right? It's free. You're making a repo and testing and checking in some files, right? There's definitely modules out there. There's more than modules, right? There's a bunch of repositories out there that have opportunities for, a beginner to kind of go in and get their hands dirty. And to be honest, even if you get it wrong, you can't really break it that bad, right? Like, assuming the repository has some safeguards in place, like I won't let you force into main. So, you could go and mess with my repo and check in stuff. And, at the end of the day, it's still somebody who has to double check and approve it. So the risk is very low.
And it opens up the world to you. You can get involved in things. You can start understanding code that you're looking at. You can start contributing more ideas. It just takes away so many barriers that could be between you and your next job or your next helpful work friendship or your next public contributions to a project, which can now sort of act as your resume, right? Like a working resume by doing more public things. I think that's one really positive aspect of the whole blogging and speaking and doing things in public thing, is that you can kind of prove that you know what you know without having to have a super long resume that tries to sway. Your work speaks for itself.
I was thinking of, I know when we chatted a little bit before, I was talking about how nervous I was the last time and how nervous I was this time, but that, we had to do sometimes you just got to do the hard things. I'm trying to remember the quote, but there's this quote about one of the fears of going out and showing yourself, as a professional, is that now you're on the hook to be that person from now on. But I think understanding that we're all learning and that it's okay to make mistakes, right? Like, I think the thing I say on my blog is like, this is not the way, it's a way. So, I'm more than open to hearing people tell me like, actually there's a better way to do this. That's how I'm going to get better, right? Like, so it's okay to go out there, say something, write a blog or whatever, present. And if you get something wrong, it's okay. Like, you can grow from that, right? Like, it's I think part of being a professional.
Your website contains quite a few quotes that are along that vein. You've got the perfection is the enemy of progress, and not just good enough. That one is, by the way, fantastic. I like that.
I don't know if you know, that actually comes from the Krusty brand.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, it's the Krusty burgers, not just good enough. But I mean, that sort of stemmed from the from the idea of like ship and iterate. Like maybe this is not 100% of where I want it, but like if I can make progress, like it's easier to take small chunks than it is to try to accomplish everything like 100%.
And to your point about being open to new ideas and not always having to have the absolute perfect answer at the time, the most successful people and the people that you'll want to work with as your career progresses are okay with that. They're okay with people making mistakes. They appreciate the honesty and can trust that. So I know that maybe it was earlier in my career or whatever. I know there's some environments that aren't as with it and maybe are a little bit more toxic. So if you're in one of those, it's not your fault. But yeah, it's just so much better to be authentic, be yourself, be honest whenever you see things. And when you learn sort of in public and are sharing things, you allow others to give that feedback and kind of ensure that you're on the right track. But if you just keep it all inside forever, you could be going the wrong direction for a very, very long time.
So Andrews has performed a miracle. Since Good Will Hunting, most people can't say it's not your fault one time and then move on. You have to repeat it 4 to 5 times. So that's impressive.
Thank you, Jordan.
All right. Well, as not only just a longtime friend of the podcast, but a returning guest, you know exactly what's coming next. It's the part that everyone dreads. You think you're ready. You're like, oh, I've done this before. I'm ready. You're not ready. You're not ready, but we're still going to give you the common parameters. Are you ready? No, you're not. Oh, see? I got you.
I'm ready, but I'm going to need a few minutes. No, I'm just kidding.
Right. What's one time something went wrong while on the job, and what did you learn from it?
I actually don't remember if you guys asked me the common parameters. I don't think you guys had common parameters last time I was on, and I always think about these questions every time I listen to the podcast.
And yet,
so it's funny because I was thinking of as a professional, the ones that always come to mind are data loss, and I think that's kind of a recurring theme that usually most folks talk about. So like even before I was professional, I remember helping a friend's dad reimage a drive, but I didn't disconnect the secondary drives, and something about the tool wiped all the drives. And they had just gotten a bunch of pictures, a new baby pictures from their from one of their kids, and I remember that was like I was absolutely gutted that I like lost that for them. Luckily, they were able to recover it, but I think I've had my fair share of mistakes. I think we were joking about one that I just had yesterday, where I sent a prompt to a bunch of folks at my company that didn't need to see that prompt. But you admit the mistake, you do your comms, you apologize, and you correct the problem, right? I mean, within under 30 minutes of seeing what the problem was, we fixed it and got that resolved. But yeah, I mean, to me, it's like that's not ideal, but I think the data loss stuff is always hard, right? It's like, especially when it's not your own data, I think it's like, I always feel like sad about that.
Right. Yeah. That's, I'd like to avoid that at all costs.
Sorry, I had to go close the door. There was a very loud conversation happening outside the door. Yeah, it was not the water heater. No, this is Martine. She knows what she did. All right, sorry, I didn't mean to be rude there, but I figured the conversation was going to pass and I'd have time, but it was not.
No, sorry.
No, we wanted to put you
I
on.
tried to keep it short and sweet.
Yeah.
All right, so with what I missed, are we ready for the second common parameter? I hope
so ready. And
I'm
Gilbert
so
nailed question 1. Like, he is doing way better than we expected. So good work so far.
I've been practicing. How many episodes is this? This is like 80 something.
80 something, 88.
Yeah, 80 something listens of these questions. I sit there on my drive to work and think about it. It's like, man, where did Well,
I'd have this one 11,012,000, but that doesn't feel right. All right, so second common parameter. With everything you know now, all of that knowledge. You've accumulated so much. What would you like to tell your younger self when you're first starting?
I'm going to hit you guys with another quote. Perfection is procrastination masquerading as quality control. That, I think, slowed me down a lot in the beginning of like, I think, and this makes a lot of sense as somebody who's starting off and seeing some folks who like contribute amazing code, and you're like, you think that people are going to go and pull you guys, both code up, and they're going to be like, oh, it's not as good as this, guys. But that's not really what happens. And it's better to ship and iterate, right? Like I mentioned, it's okay to not get it all at once. And so there was definitely a lot of stuff that, like, in fact, these blog posts sat, mostly written for like a month or two, right? And it just became one of those things where it's like, I just got to land it, and if I make a mistake, that's okay. I can fix it, right? Like, I just edit the blog. Like, what's the big deal, right? Like, we often think that the result is going to be worse than what it would actually be. Like, what's the worst that could happen if I, say something incorrect on my blog? Somebody's just going to comment saying, no, at worst, they're going to call me an idiot. And, I've been called worse, so, I'll live. Or, people are actually, what is more likely is people are going to be friendly and going to say, oh, actually, I think this piece is, you said this, but I don't think that's accurate. And that's cool, because like now I'm going to learn, right? So, take the risk, ship and iterate. Don't wait for that perfect thing, because it's not very likely to come. And what you think is perfect is probably not what actually is perfect.
Dang, you're dropping wisdom on us. And I love that approach, because to me, it sort of is like getting involved in the community in any form, even internally at work or whatever. Like when you start sharing that, you take all of the burden off of yourself, kind of like what we mentioned with like using CI/CD. Like you're now part of this bigger thing where there can be a larger conversation and you can learn from your mistakes. And the more you can not just internalize it, the better. Dang. Those car rides were worth it, man. You were mulling it over.
Time well spent. for all those work from home people, look what you're missing out on. All right. Last one. Are you ready?
Let's do it.
I just had to write a blog on this, so I can confirm this one is impossible. What are three of your favorite modules?
This one is always tricky, right? Like, and I had to go and look at what modules do I actually, in my repository, do I install first. Dynamic title is mdgrs, right? I mentioned even how it's useful to me, right? In that I can have it set the title to something that gives me information while I'm working on another title. The console GUI tools, I love TUIs. So if I don't have to do another prompt where I got to mouse over to it, that's ideal. And then the third one is PS style, which I believe Sean wrote, and that one backports PS style back to PowerShell 5 or Windows PowerShell rather. And I'm over here doing all these customizations. Some of that is coloring, and it's not often that's PS style, because I just like that the way that's formatted. And so being able to backport that to Windows PowerShell is like very handy. But it's funny because it's it's not a super complex module that's doing a bunch of crazy stuff. It's literally just setting some colors, and it makes my life easier.
I do like that.
Fair answer.
I used to think that was a softball question, and then I missed the deadline for that blog over and over. And the first one that I highlighted was PS readline. And the issue wasn't, I can't come up with the content for it. It was I didn't want to cut anything out. And it's like, well, I have limited words. It was, that blog was the most difficult thing I've written in the 7.5 years I've been here. And so here I'm just lobbing that question thinking it was a softball, and I apologize to all previous guests.
But what's funny is PS readline leverages these three modules, like I end up leveraging these modules through PS Readline in a lot of ways, right? So, like we mentioned earlier, to me, it's, it is there every day, right? Like it is, it's the hand that guides us in our PowerShell journey. That should be a t-shirt.
I like it.
Designing shirts, dropping wisdom. 3 points to Gryffindor on those questions, by the way, man. You knocked it out of the park.
So you have been a long-time listener. You were the first to comment when I first started the intros to the shill. I believe way back when, what did I say? Andrew's going to usher in the second golden age of eloquence. And you commented on that when you were the first person. That's when I knew I had to keep going with it.
I think for the people who love it, if you want to thank me, you're welcome. For the people who hate it, I'm so sorry.
People hate it. Wait.
No, I'm saying if there are people, and if they are, they're crazy, because this is one of my favorite parts.
But I will say this: you may think that as you've been here before, you're ready. You're like, oh, I've been there for the shilling before. It's no big deal. But I'm going to give you a heads up. You're not ready, because each time is majestic. It's every time Andrew starts to shill, it's like your first time seeing the ocean. It's just an experience that changes you forever. And you get a 2-time pleasure to watch a generational talent spin pure gold. Take it away, Andrew.
Breathe in the fresh air, everybody. It's been another amazing episode of the PowerShell Podcast, delivered by your glorious hosts, Andrew Plotek, DevOps Jordan, and boy, we had a great guest today. But before we get to that, give us a like, comment, and a subscription. Hit us up with a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts or your podcast platform of choice. Jordan, we're everywhere. Did you know that? Worldwide.
I've heard the rumors, yeah.
We got even a PowerShell Podcast sync project out there by some amazing listener. Might be one of our favorite guests ever. Who knows? If you want to give some feedback to Jordan and I, PowerShell@pdq.com. We love hearing from you. We also have @PowerShellPod on Twitter. If you want to tap in a little bit more and become part of our Discord community, we have a PDQ Discord with a PowerShell channel. Love to see you there. You can find me there quite regularly. Thank you so much, Gilbert, for joining us today. You knocked it out the park. Those were some of the best common parameter answers ever. Where can people find you on the internet?
So I'm usually, hey, it's Gilbert on most things. But I do have a website, links.gilbertsanchez.com, where I link to all the social stuff. So that's a great way to find links to Mastodon, X, etc.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.
I'm going to end with a personal guarantee. The next time you're a guest, I'm going to introduce you correctly. No mistakes.
No, I was just going to ask. I was like, I also need you guys to schedule me in for more time so I can beat Mr. Steven Judd.
Oh,
my good friend.
Category.
Fair enough.
All right. Well,
thank you guys so much. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Take care.
Thanks for joining the PowerShell Podcast with your hosts, Jordan Hammond and Andrew Plow.
They're serious. They mean what they're saying.
The PowerShell Podcast is a production of PDQ.com.